here I go. I am recording. Good morning, everyone. I am going to share my screen. Now everyone's gotten used to Zoom, so this is no big deal unless you're bad at Zoom now because everyone's like used to it. Good morning. My name is Jessica Pettitt, and I'm super happy to be with you. And this particular workshop that we're doing today is actually one of my like super favorite things to do. So thank you for choosing well. And I'm excited. So I do recommend you will probably want to have pen and paper with you because we're going to kind of do a model, so to speak. Those of you that are not new to this conversation, I'm going to invite you to look at this conversation as a way to have the conversation with people who might be new. And those of you that are relatively new, I invite you. Welcome. The water is fantastic. Come on in. Just a little bit about myself. So my name is Jessica, and I worked in student affairs for about 10 different years at different kinds of LGBT centers, starting them primarily working as a program advisor, also res life, orientation, campus activities, etc., and started my own business eventually, doing diversity related consulting, and my kind of LGBT identities and roots. My mouse died right over the mute button, so I muted for a second, just keeping everyone on their toes. That's what I'm doing. Anyway, so I worked in higher ed for a really long time, and then now I've started my own business doing primarily diversity-related work around conversations and connections and being responsible for ourselves. So it is always really exciting for me to kind of go back to my roots, which we'll be walking through. So again, just a little note, I kind of wasn't kidding. You probably want a sheet of paper for this. Some of you are like, oh, she's adorable. I don't know. Why would I need a sheet of paper? Because I know what's about to happen and you don't. So I would recommend a sheet of paper. That's number 3. Okay. So I also want to give you a texting number. Look, something for you to write down. So the texting number is 202-670-4262. 202-670-4262. And the reason why I give this number out is that if I truly am thought-provoking, then there is a very good chance you will have a thought after this session. And I want you to be able to text message anytime you want to about anything I could possibly be helpful with. So save it in your phone if you like. Feel free. While we are together today in this hour, you are welcome to text message any direct questions or comments. I would invite you to not put, rewind. I would invite you to put, I've only had 1 cup of coffee so far today, so be gentle. DR at the beginning of the text message if you do not want me to read it aloud. I don't know power dynamics that are present over there. And this also includes people watching the recording. You can also text message me. But DR means that I won't read it out loud, but I will respond. But you may have thoughts or comments or questions that you're not comfortable putting into the chat. So then you can just text them to me directly. It's a Google Voice number. You might be watching the recording and it could be 3 weeks from now. And I'm happy to help when you have a question, not just when I'm doing a workshop. So again, the number is 202-670-4262. So how I created this model, because I think that that's kind of important, is that when I was doing work and I was working at NYU at the time, I was the program advisor for the LGBT Center. And this is back in like the 1900s. But when people were asking for trans education, they wanted to like keep it simple, like trans 101, don't get all complicated with like race and class and gender and all that. Just trans 101. I don't want to be offensive, right? This is before we had Alexis in our life. So what was interesting is that we would be doing all of these different trainings and trying to keep it simple. And what we found is that people weren't finding themselves in the model. So if you identify as non-binary or trans-identified, et cetera, then it might be easier for you to find yourself in the model because your gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, sexual identity, just existence is already constantly in question. But for those of us that don't, or who identify as cisgender, or even possibly heterosexual, this becomes kind of a, from a privileged or dominant identity place, this becomes kind of a hobby of like collecting new information and new vocabulary words so that you can be a good one and add to your Girl Scout badge, right? So what I'm inviting us to do is to be responsible for who we are in this conversation. So we're going to be talking about actual anatomy and biology. Everyone on this call has one. If you were able to log into Zoom, you at least have thumbs, right? So like I'm making some assumptions that you probably have a physical anatomy and biological makeup. So you need to find yourself in the model. We will also be talking about gender identity, expression, roles, perceptions, things like that, which is also something that you do because you woke up this morning and you styled your hair and you figured out what clothes to wear, and you have roles within your family, within your workplace, within a grocery store, right? If you're pushing an aisle, people respond to you in a certain way because they perceive you in a certain way, and you respond to people in a certain way because you perceive them in a certain way. So that's you too. And then when we start talking about sexual identity or sexual orientation, you also have one of these too. So if keeping it simple, air quotes, giant air quotes that are probably still sarcastic from any kind of PTSD I have from doing all these trainings in the 1900s, giant air quotes is that welcome to the triangle. Welcome to the conversation. All of us should be part of this conversation. And if we can't be, then we're fixing somebody else, which is actually a power dynamic that I'm trying to actually dismantle. So with that, hopefully we're going to start at some education. Then we'll get to advocacy or inclusion or empowerment. But at education, and again, some of you are like, I already know everything, which is fantastic because now I'm going to help you be able to have a conversation with someone who doesn't know as much as you. And there are others of you who maybe haven't felt invited to this conversation, or you feel like you're okay with X and Y, but not Z and 7. So welcome. We're going to start off with some education. This is where you're going to need your pen and paper. That's number 4. Okay. So as you are grabbing your pen and paper, because I've now said it 4 times, we have to start with a binary. What is a binary? What does this mean? People throw this word around as if we know what this is. What this basically is the quantification of how lazy we are. We are super clear that there's all different kind of variations of what's happening, and we tend to reduce things down to binaries because we're lazy. This could be movie examples. So if I were to log into Netflix and say, what kind of movies are there? There's a million different categories of movies, and we reduce it down to the movies we watch and the movies we don't watch. Right? Netflix tries to recommend movies, right? And then sometimes you're like, I don't know what's going on with your machine learning, but it's wrong. I have no interest in watching this movie. And then sometimes you're like, oh, what? A documentary about the making of soap. Netflix knows me so well, right? So we reduce it down to binaries, even though we know that there is a huge category of kinds of movies. We reduce it to 2 things, which is usually us and them. And if we can remember that the binary is us being lazy, then it actually invites the opportunity to have more than 2 options, even though oftentimes we like to reduce things down to 2 options. So as we go through this activity, where you're going to need pen and paper, that's number 5, we're going to be able to keep things super stupid. We're going to super binary it down because that's where we're all comfortable to begin with. Then I'm going to mess with it. So to kind of be Hannah Gadsby, I'm telling you what's coming, you'll forget, and then we'll go back. So if you can understand that the binary is not the answers, there are not only 2 answers, there are more than that, and you are actually reducing things down, then you're in charge of the Control-Alt-Delete situation that's happening up here. And then now you're going to have to be able to practice and flex that muscle. So on your paper that of course you already have, I need you to draw a triangle. 2 points at the top, 1 point at the bottom. In drawing that triangle, you're going to label the points sex, gender, and sexual identity. Now, while you're doing that, I like to do a little explanation. I use the term sexual identity, and some people use the term sexual orientation. There's probably other terms that other people use too. My training, I use the word sexual identity, but I will explain. But if you're more familiar with the different word that kind of represents the type of relationship you're in, that is what I mean there. Okay? Sex, gender, sexual identity. Fantastic. So we're going to start first at sex, not the act of. That's a different workshop. We are going to start at anatomy and biology, and I'm going to invite you to keep it super stupid simple. We are going to binary what do I mean by anatomy and biology? So what I'm going to ask you to do, and you can put it in the chat if you want to, but a number of you are unmiked, so you're also welcome to just speak. But if I were to say, what is the first thing that comes up when we talk about biological sex or anatomical sex of a human, we're going to keep it human. What's the first thing that you think of? So you can put it in the chat or you can say it out loud. Genitals. Excellent. Okay, so here's what's interesting about genitalia. One, it's really a hard word to spell. And two, what also really comes up though is that when you say genitals, what we actually mean is a penis or not having a penis.
You were on the phone and somebody was standing in line.
Here, I'll mute people just so that people can keep having their conversations. Okay, so welcome to this time, right? We're Zooming while homeschooling and grocery shopping and wearing a mask and multitasking. I'm totally good. I have a therapist. Okay, so genitalia is the first thing that shows up. So one, it's a hard word to spell, but really what we mean by genitals is a penis or not a penis. So we mean external genitalia because we don't really like scoop around on the inside too much to find out what is or isn't happening. You either have a penis or you don't have a penis. Now, again, remember, we're keeping it simple. Binaries. Things are going to be very complicated, but we don't care. Do you have a penis? Do you not have a penis? That is the question. Okay, so then if that's genitalia, then after, what's the next thing that shows up is often chromosomes, because people get to science class. And then if I were to ask you which chromosomes does which have lining up with the binary, so the entity that has a penis would match up with the XY chromosome, and the entity that doesn't have a penis would match up with the XX chromosome. Now, the truth is there are over 500 combinations of chromosomes, but again, we are keeping this side of the triangle very simple into this very clean binary so that we can be very aware of where these two columns go down the line, right? I recognize it's more complicated and let's go there. Okay, so then genetics came up, which is also a good one and forthcoming. So stay tuned because you also have hormones. We also like to think that the entity that has a penis that has XY chromosomes also has testosterone. Fun facts, also has estrogen, but we don't like to talk about that. The entity that doesn't have a penis that does have XX chromosomes also has estrogen and also testosterone, but we don't like to talk about that. There's also many, many, many other hormones pumping around in us in order to make us who we are. But again, we're keeping it simple. What is fascinating to me, though, is that we also have some innards. Some people usually put this in the chat about like, what about? I'm Southern, so I usually refer to these things as giblets. But giblets or innards are like the internal bits and pieces that we don't know about until something's gone wrong, right? So like lactation gland things, prostate things. I was a ceramics major. So the medical bits that floating around on the inside, i.e. giblets, okay? That is generally the basis of our anatomy and our biology. But what is amazing is most of us have no idea what any of this stuff is about us unless we either do or do not have a penis. But that gets to external genitalia, right? So I do not have an external genitalia item. I do not have a penis. I'm glad. I don't know how I would have a day job if I had a penis, but that is also a different therapy session. But I also did not have no idea what my chromosomal makeup is. I actually asked my doctor to test this, and I was told I don't need to know. I have money and insurance, and I'm asking to know. No, you're denied. So I have no idea what my chromosomal makeup is, but I assume I do. Hormones, unless you're having puberty, fertility, or menopausal related issues, you don't actually even know what your hormone levels are until something goes wrong. So I think that that's an important thing. Now, somebody put in the chat about genetics. So this is usually where secondary sex characteristics show up, which is your genetics or your DNA. You kind of don't have a choice of whether you can or you cannot participate in No Shave November. So when we start talking about body hair and where body hair is, how thick it is, how curly it is, how straight it is, depends, right? And that's usually a genetic thing that's socially interpreted. I do not have facial hairs. I do, however, have a facial hair that is completely invisible until it is 9 inches long. And then usually while driving, what is it about the light in a car when you're at a red light, but you're like, oh my God, it's back, right? So I have one, I cannot participate in No Shave November, although I do travel with tweezers in November to like support. But you also have how high or deep your voice is, no control. You also have whether or not your Adam's apple, right? We even call it Adam's apple, what is happening to us, but your vocal box, whether or not that is visible or not visible. I luckily have many chins supporting my vocal box, so it is not visible. But that also has to do with the level of estrogen in my body as to where my fat is stored. So that impacts my size as well. If your estrogen level is higher, you're more likely to store fat on the front of your body or the sides of your body. If your testosterone level is higher, you're more likely to store it on the lower extremities of your body or your back. Fun facts, right? But there's a social difference between breasts and man boobs, even though both of them are fat stored roughly in the same place. So how we interpret the genetics, the DNA, the chromosomes, the physical anatomy of a physical body is socially adapted how we respond to genetics. But it's important and it stays on this side of the triangle. So if we are on the sex side of the triangle and we're keeping it simple, even though we know it actually gets really complicated, it is a very important thing to understand that most of this information we don't even know. Now, why I think this is important before we move over to gender is that often when I'm working with organizations, they're scared to talk about gender because it's complicated and I don't really know. So they default things to sex-based characteristics, which ironically, you don't know, because it's socially unacceptable to be like, excuse me, could you drop your pants? I'm looking for external genitalia before I give you your soy latte to be able to say, thank you, sir or ma'am. That is an awkward practice. If you're doing that, I would go ahead and just stop that, right? So we can't do it, but we default to the things that we think are identifiable, but we don't actually know the things that are identifiable. So we'll reduce things down to birth certificates or driver's license or things like that, except we don't know the information that those documents are assuming because we're really just trying to avoid a conversation. So that's what we're going to do today, is not avoid the conversation. So if that is sex, before we get to gender, let me just check and make sure. My texting number again is 202-670-4262. So I don't have any text yet, and I don't see any questions in the chat, but I just want to check and make sure. Do we have any questions about anatomy or biology, not the act of, different workshop? Looking good. Okay, we're going to proceed with caution as much as I can bester. So if I were to ask you, what are gendered things, we would be here forever because we have actually gendered everything. For example, have you seen a car with eyelashes on it? Have you seen this? When you put eyelashes on a car, what is the gender of the car? You're welcome to put it in chat. You can say it out loud if you like. Right. So here's what's fascinating, right? So then more stuff is coming in. Bone structure would actually be part of sex, right? Because unless you are cosmetically altering what you are born with, then you're actual, that's literally what you're doing, is changing your biology or anatomy. So that's bone structure. And bone structure is directly relevant to hormone levels. So then when I asked if you put eyelashes on a car, the first answer that came in was female. So fun facts, female and male would be sex-based words. A car isn't even a human, so wouldn't actually have an anatomical or biological sex because it's a vehicle, right? I just used it because it's actually not a gendered thing. It is actually a machine. However, when we put eyelashes on it, almost always it makes the car more feminine, or it makes the car be a woman or a girl. So those are gendered related things. Now, eyelashes are actually anatomical, right? They are hair follicles to keep bits and pieces out of your eyeballs. So male people also have eyelashes. And there are also some female people who do things to like further improve the amount of eyelash situation that's happening. So not all of us have thick, long eyelashes, even though that is what feminine women are supposed to have, which is why my pickup truck would have eyelashes on it. Do you see how none of this makes any sense? So we screw this up constantly, but it's what is like the building block of how we communicate with each other. So if we were to put eyelashes on a car, which makes the car feminine and a woman, even though it is a machine, then we now know that none of this matters. That is a very important thing to understand. It is also important to understand that a pink razor that is identical to a blue razor is actually a razor, and that's capitalism actually targeting gendered items. It's not the razor's fault. It's our fault, and we're responsible for this jacked up system. That is how I pay my mortgage. So 3, 2, 1, back to gender. So I like the word ripe because it's easy to remember and you don't leave one out, because I know somebody somewhere is going to steal this, which is fine. So gender is ripe. There are 4 different categories that are gender, and they are a Venn diagram because they overlap each other constantly. So roles, identity, perception, and expression are the 4 items. Roles, identity, perception, and expression. So I'm going to take perception out for just a second and have a conversation about roles, identity, and expression. Because roles, identity, and expression collectively are the outbound messaging that we are sending to other people, hoping that they will validate how we identify, how we show up in the world, and how we are expressing ourselves. We are hoping, whether they perceive it as truth or not, whether they perceive it as enough or not, that's up to their definitions. So I literally am just hoping that someone will trust me enough that my identity and my expression and my roles are mine for you to validate. This should not be part of this training. And yet this is the moment where hate crimes happen. People are constantly marginalized. Transphobia can happen. Sexism, heterosexism, all of these things happen in that balance between the hope of being perceived correctly based on my definitions and validated even if the other person's definitions don't align with mine. That's it. But again, I have job security, because the combination of the roles that you play at work or in your family, or how you sit in a chair, the identity, the labels you use to describe yourself to other people, and then your expression, like how you decided to show up today. Do you have big, giant arm gestures? Are you a quieter person? Are you wearing a good lady sweatshirt today? Or are you wearing a schleppy sweatshirt? We all know the difference, right? So how we are determining how we are sending out those outbound messages, and then we are hoping to get it back, that's a really important piece to understand. But the other piece that's important is that I am 100% responsible for my set of definitions that I use when I'm perceiving other people. So where I may not have any control of how someone perceives me, I have 100% control of what I need in order to perceive somebody else. So for example, you can write this down as something not to say. When a student of mine came out to me as a trans person and I responded, "Oh, Julie, how could you possibly be trans? Look at your eyelashes." How ridiculous that sounds. And for the record, Julie was not a car, was actually a student worker of mine. And I actually said that. And I'm still very jealous of their anatomical eyelash construction because it was amazing. What is important to understand is that in that moment, that student felt safe with me and they chose poorly. Because based on my definitions, that person would never be able to be validated in a more masculine way because I am jealous of their eyelashes. That is my set of definitions impacting my ability to validate someone who trusted me based on my definitions. Stop doing that. Just stop doing that. That would be easy. Just knock it off. Okay, so not always easy to do. And I fall prey to the same problem all the time because I am also an anatomical biological being that is gendered by other people with their definitions and is gendered by my own definitions. And that alternates on a fairly regular basis, depending on what I'm interested in or how I'm feeling in a given moment. So if that is sex and that is gender, and I'm responsible for my part of this, then what I need to do is slow down enough to recognize how I am constantly conflating these things together about myself, because this impacts my own body image, my own identities, how I feel I can show up in the world, my own internalized sexism, my own internalized homophobia or biphobia. That impacts me, but it also impacts other people. That's where responsibility comes in. So before we move on too much further, I want to check in again, because for some people, this might be a lot. And for other people, you have a million things to say. So I don't have any text messages again, but the text number again is 202-670-4262. And I don't see any questions in the chat, but I want to just check and do a little pause in case you need to, or someone's watching the recording. Hit pause, go to the bathroom, come right back. It's all good. Okay, I don't see any questions. We're going to keep on it going. If sex and gender are the things that we constantly conflate together, which it's important to mention would make this not a triangle, it would be a straight line. So we have to pull them apart. And I invite us all to be really reflective of how we show up inside of our own anatomy, our own biology, and our own gender identity, gender expression, gender roles, and then the definitions we use to perceive other people. If we could slow down enough and pay attention to that, that'd be really important. Now, I am not a parent. You're welcome. But some people have children, and so they also conflate these things together. I know that in my own life, within my lesbian circles and community, when all my lesbian friends started having children, we had done all this work or activism around marriage or the legalization of marriage or what this means or what it doesn't mean, or maybe we should just burn marriage to the ground. And then all my friends started having children because I'm old. And then as my friends started having children, even in utero, they started talking about their own children as if they were heterosexual. Because it's just a default. It's just a default that once they find out that their person has external genitalia, therefore that is a straight boy. And this is what they're going to do. And this is what their job's going to be. And this is how everything's going to, it just automatically happens. Even with people that I have done these trainings with, as soon as it's their thing, the agency of that thing becomes their set of definitions. So often what ends up happening is you're coming up against someone else's definitions because you now have a sense of self and agency. So when someone trusts you enough to be like, no, your definitions are inaccurate, I need to give you new information for you to update your definitions, that's literally what coming out as either not straight or coming out as not cisgender is you are coming up against somebody else's definitions and expectations because you have your own sense of autonomy and agency. Can that pretty please, occasionally, every once in a while, be validated and you just trust that I know me? That seems at the face of it quite easy to do, but unfortunately it is not for a lot of people because you're not willing to give up that somebody else has their own agency. So with that, I want to talk first a little bit about I. So you might be more familiar with the term hermaphrodite. So we don't use that word very much anymore because it's been super pathologized. But the word hermaphrodite, this is why no one invites me to parties. Example number one, hermaphrodite happens to be the ideal blend of all things male and female because their parents were, of course, consensual, fertile, heterosexual couple that had sex and resulted in hermaphrodite, the baby. Was Hermes the ideal male and Aphrodite the ideal female? When they got it on and had the ideal baby that was the perfect blending of everything male and female, they named their baby hermaphrodite. Now, it's important to mention that this is mythological and didn't actually occur, but it's really hard to come up with people because they get really into mythology. So, all right. So the term of explaining someone's internal or external anatomy or biological bits and pieces that don't magically fit into the binary that is based on our definitions was calling someone a hermaphrodite. Now, we now use the word intersex or intersex condition, which means basically that their internal or external genitalia does not fit perfectly into this binary. It may also be internal organs, hormones, things like this. Because of the rise of the internet, a lot of these folks have been able to find each other and be able to form a community of support, which is why the I is a little bit more prevalent over the last several decades. It is also important to mention that 1 in roughly 2,000 births in the United States result in external surgery happening to the baby, often without parental consent, under the guise of doing no harm. Because somebody somewhere has a job and I die, I want to come back with this job. But somebody somewhere has the job of measuring the baby external penis. And if it is shorter than a certain number, then it is deemed an extra large clitoris. So they trim it down because could you imagine the pain and suffering of being raised in our culture as a male person with too small of a penis? Ooh, the horror. So nobody cares about women and or females with their clitorises, so just chop it off. So then when they end up having fertility or possibly even puberty related issues, that's when people often find out that they were surgically modified at birth, often without parental consent. So that's the piece around intersex or intersex condition. Again, I am from the South, so I do not use any terms to describe somebody that end in ED. I have just been trained that that's generally a bad practice. So a person can be intersex, or they can identify as a person with intersex condition. So there is a question. So I may have missed this. Do the terms male and female refer strictly to sex, or can they be used to refer to gender as well? I use them strictly based on sex, female and male, because it's based on genitalia, chromosomes, hormones, things like that. What about boy, girl, man, woman? Those are gendered terms. So we're on the other side of the triangle, and they get smushed together, right? We conflate them together all the time. But when you pull them apart, male and female stays with sex, and boy, girl, masculine, feminine, man, woman, which again, notice how binary all these things are. Those stay on the gender side. Are there different words to distinguish sex from gender? You have identified those different words. Good job. Okay, so if that's the I, then the T, when you see it in the alphabet soups piece, those are my dogs. I think the male is here. When the T shows up, what this started as was using the word transsexual. And that is where someone would medically or hormonally alter their anatomical biological bits and pieces. And by medically or surgically altering their biological anatomical pieces, it meant that they were transitioning their actual anatomical and biological sex, which is why the term transsexual started being used in the first place. Now, it is also important to know that the word transgender started being used to be a little bit more inclusive, because not everybody had access to medical care. And not everybody had interest in physically altering their bodies, because it wasn't their bodies, it was all this other external label stuff. So they started using the word transgender to describe this, to be more inclusive. Then trans, or trans with an asterisk, started getting used to be inclusive of all the different gender non-conforming, gender variant, gender non-binary related identities and realities. So a lot of this is like basically academics coming up with words, right? So the only real word that has come out of the community that I'm referencing currently is the use of the word cis or cisgender. Cis, again, example number 2, why no one invites me to parties. Cis is the Latin prefix meaning congruent. So how you were labeled at birth and how you identify once you have a sense of agency about yourself. If those are the same or they're congruent, then you are cisgender. So you would be a cisgender man, you would be a cisgender woman, you have cisgender privilege. That's where the word cis comes, which actually originated out of the gender nonconforming or non-binary community, because before then, trigger warning, I was referred to as a normal person. And then here's all these inclusive words that normal people came up with to describe basically abnormal people. So this group of people were like, hi, how about you call yourself cisgender, since you have privilege that we don't have, even though you have the privilege to come up with the words and the language to describe us. So that's where the T shows up on the triangle, which we kind of went through some of that language. Now, there's some confusion often between cross-dressers, drag kings, drag queens, trans-related people, and intersex-related people. So I just like to put this in here to kind of clear anything up. You might be familiar with the term transvestite. I don't use that word anymore because I think it's been pathologized, and there are plenty of people in communities that still use TV or transvestite. But to me, the more inclusive term is cross-dresser. Most of the information we know about cross-dressers are done on white straight men who tend to wear women's clothing, often in very private situations. What I mean by that is their partners, their housemates, houseplants have no idea that they spend time in the quote unquote other gender's clothing. Notice how binary this is. When we start talking about people who are wearing quote unquote the other genders, which again, very binary, when we start talking about those folks, often if it is in a public setting, then that is more likely to be a drag king or a drag queen. A drag, again, notice how binary this is. The idea is that you are one and you are wearing the other's clothing in a very public performative way. So a drag queen is a man wearing women's clothing in a public and performative way. And a drag king is a woman wearing men's clothing in a public and performative way. Now, for the example, because we like to keep things super binary, but we know that that's not always true. A lot of times trans women may also be drag queens, and it's usually because it's good money and it's around being underemployed or unemployed. Sometimes trans men may be fantastic drag kings. That is also true, and it goes back to being under or unemployed. When I have done drag, I'm called a bio queen. And what that means is that I am a female woman person who identifies on a more masculine spectrum. So in a public and performative way, usually to raise money. And I don't do it anymore because someone always ends up going to the hospital. That's a different conversation. But a bio queen is that as a female, even though I identify as a masculine woman, when I perform drag, I am like big hair, big boobs, lots of glitter. Things are very feminine, which is not a typical gender expression for me. So all those things are possible, and we know that. We just roll it into the binary because we're lazy. Okay, so we talked a little bit about gender variant, gender nonconforming, gender bender, gender non-binary, things like this. A lot of these labels go to the fact that as a person, I am fine. This stuff is messed up. So please address me the way I would like to be addressed. And also could also be a fluidity of gender expression. What is interesting, and this is where the patriarchy tends to show up, is that when we think about androgyny or gender nonconforming folks or non-binary folks, we picture a flat-chested, more masculine expression because we default to masculinity because that's how the patriarchy works. But non-binary folks can also default to a feminine mode, and it can vary often, or it can stay pretty static. It's just, again, it's gender identity, gender expression, and gender roles as the outbound messaging that one person decides to do about themselves. Your job is to say, good on you. That's your job. That's the only job, is like, oh, I see what you're doing there. Good on you. That's it. Why this is threatening is because we can't take responsibility for ourselves, let alone find ourselves in the triangle. Okay, so I'm a fire hose. I'm aware of that. I still don't see any other questions. So if that's sex and that's gender, then when we get to, again, the cisgender privilege piece, we talk about cis man, cis woman. You might see the term just cis floating out. Sometimes there's cisgender privilege. Sometimes I see cis sexist privilege, or something is cis sexist. That's really hard to say, even though it might actually be more accurate description. So people default to cisgender because it's a little bit easier to actually say. And we don't know anybody's anatomical, biological bits and pieces because it's usually not appropriate to ask. So if that's the top of the triangle that we often conflate completely together, then when we start talking about sexual identity or sexual orientation, we should start with heterosexual and straight people. Now, you do not need to come out. But what is fascinating is when I do LGBT trainings, I'm using air quotes there as well, we never talk about straight people. So straight people have no idea that they have a sexual identity or a sexual orientation. Also, different workshop, but a little foreshadowing. When we start talking about anti-racism workshops and we never talk about whiteness, same thing happens. White people don't know that they have a race because they've never been invited to the conversation. But that's a different workshop. So sexual identity, let's start with the straight people. Again, you do not need to come out, but welcome. This is where that part shows up. You could also be gay. That's how we like to keep things binary, right? Is you're straight or you're gay. So then inside gay, whoa, where's my binary? So then we came up with gay or lesbian, right? So then it just stopped. There you go. Those are the three choices until bisexuals were like, actually, there's more. So then bisexuals started having a conversation, a lot of which were also academics, which led to pansexual and omnisexual. Then we reclaimed the word queer as kind of an umbrella group of like, I'm just not straight, like at all. But a lot of times that had to do with politics and gender identity as well. The Q also sometimes means questioning, which allows space for that. A could mean ally or advocate or accomplice. It could also mean someone who's asexual, who actually doesn't have sexual or romantic or emotional interest in other people. That does not mean they're the Unabomber. It just means that they don't have any sexual or romantic interest in other people. What's interesting is straight people will have told me as a lesbian person, straight people told me all the time, well, you just haven't met the right man. Okay, fascinating. So then when you meet someone who identifies as asexual, don't say the same thing because it didn't apply to you. It's not going to apply to them either. Well, do you masturbate? Like, what's going on with you? What is wrong with you? You are applying your definitions to somebody else, and somebody else told you how they identify, right? Like if I told you I really like popcorn, you wouldn't be like, yes, but have you tried pimento cheese? That's not going to come up because it has nothing to do with popcorn. But generally speaking, we are all capable of being jerks. That's what's important to remember. And I've been doing this workshop for 42 minutes, so I actually don't know what has shown up on Facebook, but I'm sure that there are new words because there are new words that are constantly being developed around the conflation of what one's physical body is like, what their gender identity and expression is like, and then what that means when they're in relationship with other people and or attracted to other bodies and or other gender identities. We come up with words all the time. I'm supposedly an expert. And 2 years ago, I was walking around Seattle Pride, and there were words and symbols and flags I was brand new to. And I could feel me getting defensive because have you seen my resume? I know a lot about this topic, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I don't know what that word means or what that flag means. It just means that language has developed past my level of expertise. So I, like a good 50-year-old, pulled out pen and paper from my fanny pack because I'm at Pride, and I drew a picture of the little image I hadn't seen so that I could Google it later. And while I was burdening myself with doing my own education, the person who was wearing this flag as a cape, I think saw me drawing the picture. I'm not very discreet. There's not really a lot of blending in, even at Pride, happening over here. And the person turned around and said, "Are you drawing a picture of my flag?" And I said, "I am actually, because I am unfamiliar with this and I'd like to know what it means. So I'm going to go back and do my own homework and figure it out." And they said, "Can I tell you?" And I was like, "Well, I mean, I don't want to burden you with the education of my dumbassness. Like I want you to go enjoy Pride." And they said, "Yeah, that's what Pride is. I'm very proud of this. I finally found a word and a symbol and a community that actually is who I am. I can't wait to tell you all about it." So we had frozen lemonades and we sat on the ground and they told me all about it. And like a good 50-year-old, do I remember any of the conversation? Nope. Do I remember the image? Nope. Do I remember the term? Nope. Did I update my files? Nope. Did I have a great conversation? Yes. Are frozen lemonades a joy? Yes. That is what community is about. It's not about always constantly remembering everything and updating your files. It's recognizing that I'm going to have to get comfortable with the words and images and descriptions of things that I have never heard of. Community is about sitting with that ignorance in a way that you are able to actually connect with someone else. It's not just updating your app, so to speak. So something came in on chat, very exciting. I have a drag queen bias. I need help about how to think about it. I grew up in a time when men, frat boys, Saturday Night Live, dressed as women to make fun of them, kind of like blackface. I'm okay with men dressing in women's clothing, but so often I still see drag queen stereotyping and playing on tropes of women, cat lady, cheerleader, etc. Can you help? Yes, it is super offensive to be reduced to stereotypes. I don't know that that's ever going to get comfortable, right? Like anybody being reduced down to a stereotype, that's yucky and itchy and not exciting. And it is also what we click on, right? So even if you think about like, if I can help you, Karin, with the clickbait that happens online, I had a New Year's resolution that if I click on it and I have to click again to get to the next page, then I'm off. Like I'm trying to get rid of those things. Like just give me all of the pictures of the stupidest tattoos anyone's ever gotten. I don't want to have to click through all 57 of them. So I stopped doing it. They stopped showing up in my algorithms. Now I get all of them. The reason why I'm paralleling this is that the performative piece and the action-based piece is based on our performance. So what tends to work or what tends to be more entertaining is the stereotypes, which is literally why blackface, I don't know anybody in the whole world who's like, you know what, I actually think blackface is a great idea. We have ample evidence that it is a horrible, terrible idea, and people still do it because they're lazy and dumb and go directly to the stereotypes. Same thing happens when we start talking about dressing as a woman. We go directly to a stereotype. Dressing as a man, we go directly to a stereotype. It's easier and it's lazy. So how do you get more comfortable with the outcome of basic general society being lazy and dumb? Is trying really hard not to be lazy and dumb yourself. That is not a very super helpful answer, but it is the best answer that I can think of, is recognizing when are you defaulting down to stereotypes. And if you stop doing that, then maybe that will update the algorithms of culture and we would all stop finding stereotypes easy and accessible and entertaining. It's the entertaining piece that I think is the most hurtful, because you're literally finding entertainment based on the pain and suffering of being a subordinated identity. I would say exactly the same thing even happens in the broader LGBT community when somebody is actually trying to roll the LGBT community up in by even just saying LGBT, but like as if that's one entity instead of 4 words generally created by white people to describe what kind of not straight they are. By zooming them all together, you go to stereotypes. So even drag queens themselves are a stereotype that are representative of a group that is not representative of all the people in the community. So I don't know if that's helpful, but recognize when you're doing it, even recognizing that you have a bias is helpful, right? Like, oh, look, this is tripping up this thing, which is connected to this thing. And that's why I'm having the feeling that I'm having. According to my therapist, acknowledging the feeling you have is step 1. Still working on that part. So what, in regards to dressing up, is it offensive to dress up as other races at Halloween? Always wondered. Here's a safe answer. Yes. Be creative. You do not need to dress up as anything that was ever living. That way it is not offensive. My favorite Halloween costume, and I want to point out how comfortable this was, feel free to steal it, was a red sweatshirt and red sweatpants with Band-Aids all over them. I got to go to a party in sweats. And what was I? A dependent clause, because they looked like Nicorette patches, which were new that year. You're welcome. Go to parties in sweatpants. That's not offensive. Dressing up like actual living people can be offensive. Same thing goes with the cultural misappropriation. I know we're getting slightly off topic, but cultural misappropriation about gifts that you received when you were in the Peace Corps or when you traveled to some other country, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, it is true. When I went to Mongolia after graduate school, I stayed there for almost 6 months. And one of the women in the little town, it's not a town, circle of Gers that I stayed with because I was visiting a friend in the Peace Corps, made me this gorgeous, beautiful dell. It is wonderful. It's satin. She made the actual design of it all. She made it for me while I was there. It's like one of my most treasured possessions. And when I wear it outside of this particular village in Mongolia, it definitely looks like I'm somehow misappropriating some kind of Asian community. And my general like fix it white ladiness was like, no, let me tell you about this woman in Mongolia. Nobody has any time for your pamphlet or your little TED talk. In this culture, that looks bad. And how I know this is when I was like, oh, well, if I can't wear it to work, maybe I'll wear it for Halloween. Then you are reducing it down to a stereotype, which is actually disrespectful of the woman who gave it to me in the first place. So it hangs in my closet because I love it. And in this culture, we're so jacked up, I can't wear it in this culture because it could have a negative impact on someone else. And that is where I'm responsible, is I get to pick and choose what to wear. So hopefully that helps. The O stands for omnisexual. Good job, 2 points. Let's see what else. Lots of things are happening. Okay, we did that. I wanted to be a sushi chef and have my baby be a piece of sushi, but then wasn't sure if it was offensive. And then it caused me to reflect deeper. I know it sounds stupid, but I don't know. Here's what's fun. That is adorable. And also, are you talking about cannibalism? I don't know. And if there's a million other ways of being very, very creative. And I believe it's not about not doing something, although that's not true. There is a long list of things you could just not do. That would work out great. But what I would prefer you to do in your thinking is to not worry about what you cancel or delete, but recognizing what is your intention of what you are doing. What are the possible intended or unintended impacts of what it is that you are doing? And then if you choose to do it anyway, you are now you're prepared and you are already responsible for what the impact is, whether or not you were aware of what the intended or unintended impact could be, but you like thought about it. So when you had the thought about being a sushi chef and your baby dressing up like a piece of sushi, there is a piece of that that is adorable. I could see that working out really great. If I was the baby, I'd get to sleep and be one of those kinds that's just the fish on top, right? I don't have to move. It's wonderful. And if it's offensive to someone else and I'm not prepared to engage in that responsibility, note not the pamphlet sharing TED Talk explanation of it, but if I don't want that to happen, then just come up with something else that's maybe not an actual person or that's not actually another culture that is being misrepresented down to stereotypes. That's important. I think that if we were to take this sushi chef thing, if you were to wear a uniform, right, and be a sushi chef, that's one thing. But if you are in a uniform, but you are now defaulting to very Asian stereotypes and painting on like a thin mustache and doing something with your eyes or something like that. Now, if we get back to the triangle, look at that transition. What you're doing is changing anatomical, biological bits and pieces to be the joke that is the stereotype that is your costume. That's definitely when you've gone too far. If you are doing something to change who you are to align with the stereotype so that the costume is more likely to be perceived based on other people's racist definitions, and you're seeking that validation, then now you're trapped inside of definitions that you recognize are stereotypes. That's the piece that you can undo. That is definitely not part of this usual program, but I think that was an important conversation to have. Okay, I also got a text message. Let me take that really quick. Oh, 7 minutes. What do you think about these people claiming to be super straight and adding SS to LGBTQIA? Personally, that is also like men wanting a men's center. That's called the planet. Can I just keep this one little couch that's poorly funded? Could I do that? I don't know that super straight people or super straight as an identity needs to be part of a subordinated, marginalized space. And if we're talking about sexual orientation or sexual identity, bring it on. That's evidently what your sexual identity is. Good on you. You're probably very well received. So then you don't necessarily need additional support. That's what I would say. Give them a phone number. All right. So now in order to do the very last bit of this, we have to throw in our friend oppression. And in order to do this, what we need to do is recognize that we conflate sex and gender together into one thing. Then that also reduces down to a stereotype as to what someone's sexual identity or sexual orientation is. So for example, the idea of being not straight is actually a white thing, because white people don't have to deal with so many gender and sex roles or stereotypes. So we have the freedom of coming out as not straight. Obviously, you do not have to be white to not be straight, but because it's the first, often maybe second subordinated or marginalized identity, and how white supremacy shows up in the LGBT community, that is why that defaults to those particular characteristics when people of all different kinds of gender, class, race, but size, religion, political affiliations can have whatever kind of sexual identity or sexual orientation they have that is against the stereotype. So again, the binary shows up in this really simple, stupid way. So that is also why when I talk specifically to other white queer people, and I'm using queer as the umbrella term there, but when I talk to other white queer people, it is almost impossible for them to begin to have a conversation about white privilege and how white supremacy shows up in their life as a white identified person, because they want to go to their subordinated and marginalized identities, which is being raised poor and being queer, right? And you don't know about my like mental or physical disabilities. That's fantastic. I am not saying that pain is less or more. That is not a measuring stick I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is reducing pain and suffering. So where you have had marginalized and silenced experiences, you should be able then to use those as sources of empathy, because we're going to talk about responsibility for our dominant identities. So when we start talking about responsibility, let's talk about employed during a global pandemic. Let's talk about having access to an education. Let's talk about being literate. There are millions of people on this planet that will never learn to read in their entire lifespan. And I'm going to go on a limb here. Most of us have a pile of books by our bed that we promise we're going to read someday, because we don't even acknowledge the responsibility of what it means to be literate. right? Now that's a very different spectrum, but if you realize some kind of recoiling that's happening around those privileged identities, it's probably because you've done a lot of work organizing from your subordinated and marginalized places to stay alive. Not saying it's not valid, but you're trying to stay alive. You're trying to like have a roof over your head or a job or get some food. Okay. And you can also do responsibility work from your dominant and privileged identities. If we can understand how that works, then we can use our dominant privileged identities for good. That, spoiler alert, actually dismantles these systems way more than the organizing that we're currently doing to try to stay alive. Organizing to stay alive is not dismantling systems. It's trying to like stay alive. This is a hobby intellectual activity that you can do at no cost that actually will dismantle the systems that are causing this pain and suffering. That is why I demand that we take responsibility for our privileged identities. So I feel that way about including ally in the LGBTQA, where the cis hets, why are cis hets in the acronym? Okay, acronym. I always say that word wrong. An acronym is when like a Diet Coke can shows up in Game of Thrones, and the word is acronym, which is letters smushed together. So here is why A, as in ally, often shows up in this community, and we can have an intellectual conversation about it, but we're running out of time. Mostly it's because if someone comes out as an ally, it's usually because they're advocating for somebody else. And when they advocate for somebody else, we, stupid people, actually roll it back down to a binary. And by rolling it back down to a binary, we assume they're closeted or they are also one of the people that is being targeted, because we couldn't possibly get familiar with someone doing work from their privileged or dominant identities. So they are often targeted by the same hate crimes or violence. So that's why A sometimes gets added in. I am not particularly familiar with super straight. I'm going to go on a limb and just say I am okay with that. But to me, that seemed like an identifier of their sexual identity or orientation, whereas an ally is an identifier of their behavior that is putting them at similar risk. Trans is also not a sexual orientation, and it's lined up because it's the gender nonconforming piece that actually makes people be targets of hate and violence. It's not usually the sex acts because those are typically done in private. Anyway, we have 1 minute left. So please close your eyes because you're about to get vertigo, because I'm going to go through some slides pretty quickly, but I want to make sure that we land on this piece. So if we add oppression into the mix, there is an oppressive force between sex and gender that polices who gets these unicorn points. And what I mean by unicorn points here is just privilege in general, right? We conflate them together. It ends in ism. I call this sexism. So if we were to take a sexist culture like, how about the United States, then it is actually, watch this, are you ready? Masculine male men, not postal service workers, right? They're masculine male men, so cisgender men, who also, if we talk about cis het, that's what that means, right? Is that they're heterosexual, masculine male men. They are given the most unicorn points. But cisgender women, hi, how are you? We also have a responsibility because people are lazy and put things down to a binary. But we have more power and privilege to work with by being a cisgender woman than a gender nonconforming or non-binary person. We have some responsibility. Yes, we have someone to point to and be like, but that doesn't absolve us from the responsibility of the unicorn points we also get by fitting into that binary. Then between sex and gender being smushed together and sexual orientation or sexual identity, another oppressive force ends in ism. It's a long word. Heterosexism is the assumption that everything and everyone and everywhere is heterosexual until you're proven otherwise. And then it is at that intersection, when we start talking about intersectionality or simultaneity, it's at that intersection where you have so much power and privilege, possibly unicorn points to spend, whether you identify this way or not. If you are afforded those unicorn points, it's at that intersection specifically related to these three items that you could do the most work to actually be able to dismantle these systems. Now, when you start labeling in race, class, political belief, education, accessibility, immigration issues, access to language, then those unicorn points can go up and down depending on what those are. but it's really important to kind of invite people into the conversation about what we mean by an intersection. And that's two different oppressive forces where, let's say in this case, you are given unicorn points at the intersection. So now we're talking about cisgender heterosexual. You are given unicorn points when other people aren't. That's where responsibility begins. And I like to point that out as at least one intersection. We all pretty much default to this now, obviously being white people who are college educated, at least able-bodied US citizens of a certain age, which is usually for some reason it caps off in the high 20s. Everybody else is old or too young. We value people differently. But as soon as you can get people to recognize that they value people differently, now we can have a conversation about being responsible about the validation through our definitions of what we are perceiving. Now we're getting somewhere. And if you can get to that somewhere, that's when we can actually start thinking about inclusion. Because now you're in the mindset to have a conversation about what words do people use to describe their family or themselves? How do documents or membership questions, how is that showing up? How do vendors or suppliers, are we holding them accountable to these same definitions? What about signage or marketing and where things are going and how we're dividing people up? What about facilities or accommodations? What kind of definitions are we operating under? When you are able to have those conversations, then you can get to non-discrimination policies and guidelines and things that you're doing or protocols. That cannot happen. That work cannot happen if people can't find themselves in the conversation to begin with. That's why I think it's so important. When we start talking about inclusion and equitable access to their voices weighing the same, the common denominator is who has the opportunity to give away and who is hoping to be available for the opportunity. That's a binary that if we can wrap our brains around that binary, we can start doing work with the opportunities that we actually have. From there, we can actually get to empowerment and advocacy for other people. So I know I'm 3 minutes over. I apologize. And I want to make sure if you have any thoughts or comments or questions, and on the recording, the number again is 202-670-4262. If I have done my job, you will think about something while you are cooking dinner, and you are welcome to text message me. But for now, what are your thoughts, comments, anything that I can help with? How are things going? What can I do to help? I did an awesome job. Well, thanks so much. Great. Thank you very much. I've been sheltering in place for 1.5 years with an introvert. So please keep the compliments going because my dogs don't care. I don't even believe them anymore. All right. Love a part 2 addressing advocacy more, possibly, sure, happy to help. But for now, I'm going to leave you hanging. So if you need anything, feel free to text message 202-670-4262. I highly encourage you to do a little self-assessment and decide when are you affording opportunities to other people and when are you hoping an opportunity will come your way. And where you are affording opportunities for other people, that is where you can use your unicorn points for good and actually dismantle the systems that are causing pain and suffering. So thank you very much, y'all. Have a great day. And I look forward to working with y'all again if need be.